Today we're at Bentley Priory, and that's because during the Battle of Britain, this building right here was the headquarters of RAF Fighter Command. Now, Bentley Priory, or this building, has a long history. It's originally believed that it was founded in 1170. Later in the 1500s, it exchanged hands and was privately owned by a few different individuals, including brief ownership by King Henry VIII. In 1926, the Ministry of Defence acquired this site, and it was going to become absolutely key during the Battle of Britain, because this was going to be the headquarters of Fighter Command. Now, in recent videos we've been talking about the Battle of Britain that was fought in the skies above the UK in autumn 1940. Well, that had to be commanded from somewhere, and it was commanded from right here. So today we're going to go take a look. Bentley Priory today has a museum and some really interesting bits that talks about what went on here. So we're going to go and explore and tell some of the story of what happened right here at Bentley Priory. So when you come into the kind of main sort of lobby area here of the Priory, straight away on the right they have the portrait of Air Chief Marshal Dowding. So here he is, the man who was in charge here at Bentley Priory during the Battle of Britain. Now they have a fair bit of information about him here, and in fact through this door here they have his office that still remains here today. Now unfortunately we can't film in there, which is understandable, but I believe there are a couple of photos that we'll be able to share into the video so you guys can have a look and see what that's like. But if you come here, they do a really interesting sort of video film, and you can see into that office, which is really fascinating. So I'll try and include a photo for you here. But this is where he was based, where his office was, just behind this wall here at Bentley Priory. Now, just stepped out the front of the Priory for a second to take a minute to talk a little bit more about Dowding. Now, Dowding was Commander-in-Chief here of Fighter Command. Now, he felt really strongly that a strong fighter command was going to be essential in the defence of Britain. Now, after Dunkirk in 1940, we got to a position where Hitler had every intention of trying to invade the British Isles. There was a strong focus on bomber command at the time and bombing targets in France, but Dowding felt really strongly that the fighter command was going to be essential, and in fact he wrote a letter to the Defence Ministry expressing that view, and actually have that letter here on the wall, which we're going to take a look at in just 1 second. So here in this frame, just near the kind of entrance to the Priory, they have the letter that I'm talking about. Now you can read the whole letter online if you're interested, but this last little section here is really interesting. It says, from Dowding, I believe that if an adequate fighter force is kept in this country, if the fleet remains in being, and if home forces are suitably organised to resist invasion, we should be able to carry on the war single-handedly for some time, if not indefinitely. And you can see the letter is signed by Dowding himself. So this kind of main sort of round room is really fascinating. They've got so many stories related to the few. So that is the pilots and airmen who flew in the Battle of Britain. We're going to look at just a couple of the unique individual ones now, but they've got so many here. Unfortunately, we can't possibly get to all of them individually, but there's a couple of really cool ones which we're going to pick out. So they've got the stories of lots of different airmen here, but one which jumped out to me, which I found very interesting. This is Flight Lieutenant James Brindley Eric Nicholson. Now he was the recipient of the VC during the Battle of Britain, and in fact he was the only member of Fighter Command to be awarded the VC in the whole of the war. In November 1940, his plane was badly shot up, and in fact it caught fire, the Hurricane that he was flying. He went to bail out but saw more enemy aircraft moving in, so he stayed in his plane despite the fact he was wounded and it was on fire to engage those enemy. He eventually had to bail out, and on the way to the ground he was accidentally mistaken for a German pilot, and the Home Guard opened fire on him and he was wounded further. He survived those wounds and he was awarded the Victoria Cross. He tragically died later in 1945 during a bombing sortie. Here we go. Flight Lieutenant James Brindley Eric Nicholson. So here's another really cool one. Here we've got the flight jacket belonging to Pilot Officer Jocelyn George Power Millard. You can see kind of the sort of sheepskin collar and the leather outer, something you guys will be familiar with if you have watched the series Masters of the Air. They show the guys wearing these types of jackets. And then something which I thought was really cool, down here we have the control column. This is the control column from an unidentified British fighter plane. So another really interesting one. Here we've got some of the uniform that belonged to Flying Officer Brendan Eamon Fergus Finucane. Now, Finucane was actually an Irish pilot who joined the RAF. Now, given some of the history between Ireland and Britain, that was perhaps slightly controversial at the time in the 1930s, but he joined the RAF and apparently he struggled. It took him a long time to get the hang of flying, and in fact at one point it was even suggested, hey look, maybe we should relieve this guy of his position, but he persisted, got his wings, became a pilot, and was very successful, being promoted right the way through the ranks in the RAF. If we look down the bottom here, we have got some of his medals. Now you can see the DFC, which is the one that's the second one in from the far side, has got 2 bars on it. Well, that means he was awarded that 3 times the initial medal and then 2 further times, which is where the 2 bars get added to the medal. Now, as with so many pilots, unfortunately, the war didn't end well for Brendan Finucane. He was flying his Spitfire on the 15th of July 1942 when it was badly shot up and he had to make a crash landing in water in the English Channel. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to bail out before his Spitfire went into the water and he was lost. He was never recovered. This is something that's quite interesting. So one of the things that you hear about quite often is what's referred to as the pilot's wings. Well, here they've got all the different ones. So for example, here we've got the wings of the RAF. We also then have all the different ones. So this is the Canadian one. Here we have the wings of New Zealand. Here we have the wings of the South African Air Force. And lastly, Rhodesia. Really interesting. Now, one of the things they display quite a lot here are the medals of some of the men. So, for example, here we've got the medals of Pilot Officer Edward James Watson. Here in this display case, we've got the 1939 to 45 Star, which has the Battle of Britain clasp on it. The clasp being this bar that runs across just here, across the ribbon. Next to that is the Aircrew Europe Star. Next to that's the Burma Star. And on the right there is the 1939-1945 War Medal. Something which I learned today, a little medal which actually I hadn't been aware of before. In the middle here they talk about some of the medals, and one of the things they've got is this. This is the Caterpillar Club badge, and the Caterpillar Club was opened for aircrew who had bailed out from their aircraft and had survived. It's really interesting, learning something new here. One of the interesting things they've got here when you come into the main building is some information about the men from 15 different nations who flew and fought to defend Britain. Now, we've talked about this before, that it wasn't just British pilots. In fact, you can see on here we had 145 airmen from Poland who were involved. That was largely men who had escaped from Poland during the German invasion. And in for example, we've got a statue here of a airman by the name of Marshal who escaped Poland to Romania after the fall of Poland, and he continued the fight against Germany in France. After arriving in Britain in June 1940, he was posted to 303 Squadron. Now, you might recognise the name 303 Squadron. That's because there is a movie made about that story, which is based on Marshal Ferrick's diary. And they have a statue of him just here. Another key aspect of what Dowding did was really focus on the development of the radar system, but also its integrated parts beyond the radar itself, how it could be used in an operational way to make sure that the fighter command had the up-to-date information in order for them to fight efficiently, but also to defend this country. Well, that was called the Dowding system. And they've got a whole load of information about it here, which we're going to take a look at as we explore. Now, one of the most fascinating bits they have here at Bentley Priory is this. This is the filter room, and this has been recreated. They've used old photos and stuff to try to recreate it pretty much as it would have been, but this is the filter room at Bentley Priory, and you can see one of the photographs here that they've used to try to recreate this. Now, when we talk about the Dowding system, we are talking ultimately about radar, but not just radar. It's also to do with how the radar was then used in conjunction with other parts of the system, telephones, mapping, radios, to be used in a workable way every day. So in very simple terms, you had something like a radio tower, which looked a little something like this. That would send out a signal, and if that signal detected an aircraft, it would bounce a signal back. Now that would be great because it would tell you that an aircraft was there, but ultimately all it would really tell you is that there was an aircraft somewhere within the field and arc at which it had sent out that signal. That's where a place like this came into play. So what they could do, using a mapping board like this, which you can see has got marked on it kind of all the different sort of signals being bounced out in every direction, they could compare the information from all the various radars and the different signals that they had, and they could use those to plot where an aircraft was. Now, of course, aircraft move, and they move quite quick, which meant this had to be updated live, and that's why you would have a whole load of people working here on telephones and radios to keep this information constantly updated live. You can imagine how important this was, not only to do the work, but to get it right. I mean, these guys were talking about, you know, the lives of pilots and essential information to enable the actual airmen to operate. You can see the big kind of viewing gallery above, which would have been used to give the guys in charge an actual sort of live view of what was going on below them. This is crazy to think about, right? I mean, this is 80 years ago, but in reality now we could probably get this information, you know, live on a satellite app on our phone. But it wasn't like that in 1940. This had to be kept up to date via telephone, via radio, from signals being sent out by radar. When you think about the amount of work that went into this and how successful it was, it really is incredible. So on this information board here, they talk a little bit about how that was done in a more structured way, which is really interesting. So initially they had the plotter. Their job was to take the information that was coming from the radar stations, with each plotter being linked to one radar station by telephone, and they would then plot that information onto the map table over here. You then would have a filterer who had the job of kind of filtering all that information, comparing the information coming from each different radar station to try to use that to work out height, range, direction or heading of that aircraft. You then had the controller. The controller's job was to ensure kind of that overall picture was as accurate as possible, and they would then make decisions on what had to happen next. You then had the movement liaison section. They were positioned above, so we talked about the balcony, so that's what they were for up there on the balcony. So they had the slightly higher position, the plotters and the filterers being down here. Up there from the balcony, they had the direct lines to the airfield, so they could sort out kind of any confusion or sort of rapid response that was needed. And then lastly, you had the teller, and the job of the teller was to report all of this filtered information directly out to the operations rooms, and that was done by telephone which would go out as concisely as possible once all this information had been brought together. And all of this in turn, from radar right through to what happened in this room, is the Dowding system. Things I love that they do here is they talk about the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. Now, women played a huge role in the Battle of Britain, and especially somewhere like this at Bentley Priory, and we're going to talk about some of their stories in just a minute. Now look, we touched on the fact that some of the statues here, or the models, are women. Well, these aren't just randomly depicted women. These are based on actual women who worked here at Bentley Priory. So for example, this statue right here, we are looking at the statue of Patricia Clark. And if we look up here above us, we can see Patricia worked here at Bentley Priory. She was trained at RAF Leighton Buzzard and later became a plotter and a teller who worked right here at the Priory. Here in the back and the centre we have another model, and here we are looking at Aline Younghusband. Aline joined the WAAF in April 1941 after her cousin, who was a fighter pilot, was killed. She trained as a plotter at the training facility at RAF Leighton Buzzard and arrived here at Bentley Priory in September 1943. She worked as a filterer with a focus on V2 missile attacks. Wow. And each of these models of the different women here are depicting real women. Wow, it's really fascinating how they've done that, and it demonstrates some of the importance of the roles that the women played here at Bentley Priory. And in fact here we have a photo taken in 2013 when a lot of these veterans returned here for the opening of the museum here at Bentley Priory. So here in the filter room, all of that information was, as described, filtered. And once it had been filtered, and once it had been plotted, and once all the information had been worked out accurately, it had to then be passed on to the operations rooms. Now, there were operations rooms around the country, but there was one based here at Bentley Priory, and it was actually in the room next door to here. So here, next to the filter room, is the main ballroom in the Priory. And this large room is what was used as the operations room, and you can see why. It's a big room, lots of space and a high ceiling, so you can have the two levels with the balcony. Now over in the middle here, they've actually got a recreation of what this room looked like when it was being used as the operations room. So as we've been looking in this room, we've talked about some of the kind of temporary structure that had to be built in order to create a facility like this effectively. Well, when we move over into the operations room, or the ballroom where the operations room was, they've got this really interesting display case that kind of shows us how some of that worked here. So in this room you can see they had the map table down here in the middle, and then some of the higher balconies, and you can see all the radios and telephones along the back. That was all set up in this room. It was built using temporary scaffolding and wood. You can see all of this display depicting what was set up in this room right here for the operations room at Bentley Priory. Now it's worth noting that whilst the filter room was actually in here prior to the war, and the operations room was in the room next door in the ballroom, at about 1940, at the outbreak of the Battle of Britain, for safety, both these two rooms were actually moved to the underground bunker that was here at Bentley Priory. So they were still here on site in the Battle of Britain, but they weren't actually in these two rooms at the time. They had to be moved due to the threat of bombings and the danger of having a room like this exposed in a building above ground. Just taking a second to step out the back into the garden of the Priory, and wow, I mean, this is a beautiful site. You can see why they chose this to be the headquarters of Fighter Command. This really is a a beautiful building and fascinating history that went on here. And like I said, the history here dates back way prior to World War II, right the way back to 1170. I think they believe that the Priory here was founded. Wow, beautiful place. Now, Dowding had actually been near retirement age at the outbreak of the war, and so at the end of October 1940 he actually stepped down as Air Chief Marshal of RAF Fighter Command. But the time that he had in charge here between July and October 1940, whilst based here at Bentley Priory, was so essential. And I think, whilst some people might argue, I think generally speaking, the historical view would be that had Britain not really won that Battle of Britain, had they not successfully taken command of the skies above the United Kingdom, then Hitler would have moved forwards with his plan to invade the British Isles. And just think how differently the war could have gone if that had happened. The UK couldn't have been used as a base for the invasions on D-Day. The Americans wouldn't have been able to fly their air force from here. The whole outcome of World War II could have been entirely different if it wasn't for the successes in the Battle of Britain. Largely controlled from Bentley Priory right here. Now, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, taking a look around Bentley Priory and telling some of the story of what happened here. I found this site a really fascinating one. I really recommend you come here and check it out for yourself if you get the opportunity to. If you enjoyed it, do me a favour, do all the usual YouTube stuff right here on the screen. Thanks very much for watching. I'm going to see you on the next video.